At a family barbecue, I accidentally bumped into my husband's teenage daughter. A few drops of iced tea spilled onto her designer sandals. She immediately shattered her glass on the stone patio and screamed, "Do not ever touch me again! You are just a freeloading maid pretending to be my mother." My husband marched over, glared at me with pure disgust, and coldly said, "Apologize to her right now or leave." So I walked away. When they got home later that day, a massive shock was waiting for them. My name is Nina, and at 33 years old, I had spent 3 years swallowing my pride to keep the peace in a family that never wanted me. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their perfect lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been treated like an outsider by the people who were supposed to love you. It was a sweltering Saturday afternoon in a wealthy, highly exclusive suburb of Chicago. My mother-in-law, Patricia, was hosting her annual summer kickoff barbecue at her sprawling estate. The property was designed to be intimidating, featuring a pristine limestone patio, a massive infinity pool that seemed to spill over into the manicured horizon, and towering hedges that looked like they belonged in a luxury magazine. I had spent the entire morning trapped inside the sweltering kitchen, chopping vegetables, marinating meats, and arranging elaborate appetizers on crystal platters, while everyone else lounged comfortably by the water. Patricia treated me less like a daughter-in-law and much more like unpaid catering staff. She would breeze into the kitchen, point a perfectly manicured finger at a slightly misaligned cheese board, and sigh heavily before walking back out to her guests, without offering a single word of thanks. My husband David, who was 9 years older than me, was standing near the outdoor bar laughing loudly with his friends and completely ignoring the fact that I was running myself ragged to serve his family. To make matters worse, his ex-wife Vanessa was also at the party. Patricia always invited her, claiming they were keeping things civilized for the sake of the family, but the underlying message was clear. Vanessa was standing incredibly close to David, sipping a cocktail and tossing her hair back as she laughed at his jokes. The entire scene was meticulously designed to make me feel small, replaceable, and entirely unwelcome. I was the second wife, the woman they all believed was desperately clinging to David for financial survival. They thought my modest freelance data entry work was just a pathetic excuse for employment. They had no idea who I really was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead. I picked up a massive, heavy silver tray loaded with tall glasses of freshly poured iced tea. The condensation made the metal slippery, and my arms were already aching from hours of carrying heavy platters back and forth from the main house. I navigated carefully through the dense crowd of wealthy neighbors and extended family members. No one moved out of my way. No one offered to help or hold a door. I had to weave between expensive lawn chairs and patio heaters, keeping my eyes entirely focused on balancing the sweating glasses so I would not cause a scene. My stepdaughter Brittany, who had recently turned 17, was holding court on the edge of the limestone patio. She was wearing a new pair of excessively expensive designer sandals that David had bought for her just the day before. Brittany had made her absolute disdain for me obvious from the very first moment David and I started dating. She constantly reminded me that I did not belong in their affluent circle, often making loud passive-aggressive comments about my clothes or my car whenever her friends were around. Today she was busy taking selfies by the pool, entirely focused on her phone screen, posing and pouting for the camera, while completely ignoring the crowded party around her. As I approached the seating area near the edge of the pool, I tried to give Brittany a wide berth. The silver tray was growing heavier by the second, and my fingers were cramping from the icy cold condensation. Without any warning, Brittany took 3 abrupt blind steps backward, right into my path to get a better angle for her photo. I tried to twist my body to avoid a direct collision, but the heavy silver tray shifted violently in my hands. The thick glasses clinked together loudly, threatening to tip over and smash onto the ground. I managed to engage my core and keep the tray from falling, but the sudden jerking motion caused a small splash of iced tea to slosh over the rim of the closest glass. Exactly 3 drops of iced tea landed squarely on the toe of Brittany's pristine designer sandals. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly explosive. Brittany looked down at the tiny amber spots on her shoes, and her face contorted with absolute, unhinged fury. She raised the crystal lemonade glass she had been holding in her right hand and hurled it directly onto the hard limestone patio. The heavy crystal shattered violently, sending sharp, glittering shards flying across the stone in every direction. The loud crash silenced the entire yard instantly. The upbeat summer music seemed to fade away as every single guest stopped talking, turned their heads, and stared directly at us. Brittany pointed a manicured finger right at my face, her chest heaving with theatrical rage. "Do not ever touch me again," she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent pool deck. "You are just a freeloading maid pretending to be my mother." I stood completely frozen. The heavy tray was still trembling in my aching hands, and my face was burning with intense, suffocating humiliation. The silence in the yard was deafening. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Vanessa smirking from the bar, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. Patricia stood nearby with her arms crossed, shaking her head in profound disappointment, clearly placing the blame entirely on me. I waited for David to intervene. I waited for my husband to parent his entitled child to step forward and defend his wife against such a vicious, degrading public attack. I watched as he marched across the patio, his jaw clenched tight, his posture rigid with anger. But when he finally reached us, he did not look at Brittany. He did not reprimand her for throwing glass or screaming like a spoiled child. Instead, he turned his furious gaze entirely on me. His eyes held nothing but sheer, unfiltered disgust. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded loudly, making absolutely sure the entire crowd of guests could hear his reprimand. I tried to explain, my voice shaking slightly under the weight of dozens of staring eyes. "David," she stepped backward into me. "I was carrying the tray. It was an accident. I did not even mean to." He cut me off immediately, raising his hand in a sharp, dismissive gesture to silence me. "Apologize to her right now or leave. You always ruin these family events because you are jealous of her." The echo of David's ultimatum hung heavily in the humid suburban air. Apologize to her right now or leave. I stared at the man I had married 3 years ago, searching his face for a single trace of the partner who had promised to protect me and stand by my side. There was absolutely nothing. I saw only cold and hard resentment in his eyes. He stood with his shoulders squared, physically blocking me from his daughter, as if I were an imminent threat rather than his loyal wife. The yard around us remained entirely motionless. Dozens of guests, affluent neighbors, and relatives I had spent the last 48 hours cooking and cleaning for watched with bated breath. They were waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They fully expected me to lower my head, swallow my pride, and beg a spoiled 17-year-old girl for forgiveness over 3 accidental drops of iced tea. Before I could even process the absolute betrayal of my husband taking his daughter's side over a blatant lie, his mother saw her perfect opportunity. Patricia stepped forward from the shadow of the massive outdoor kitchen. The ice in her crystal cocktail glass clinked softly against the heavy silence of the yard. She glided across the limestone patio with the practiced elegance of a woman who had spent her entire life dominating country club social circles. She did not look at me with anger. She looked at me with intense, condescending pity, which was infinitely worse. "She is just bitter, David," Patricia announced loudly. Her voice carried a theatrical sigh designed to ensure every single person in the backyard heard her verdict. "We all know she only moved into your beautiful house 3 years ago because her little data entry gig could not pay her rent." The words were carefully crafted to strip me of any remaining dignity, and Patricia delivered them flawlessly. She reached out and placed a manicured, jewel-encrusted hand on David's arm. She cast a sorrowful look at Brittany, who was now expertly forcing a few tears to well up in her eyes to play the role of the victim. "It is classic resentment," Patricia continued to her captivated audience. "A woman who has nothing looking at a girl who has everything. You really should have listened to Vanessa." At the deliberate mention of her name, the crowd seemed to part slightly. The shift revealed Vanessa standing near the edge of the infinity pool. David's ex-wife was a vision of expensive maintenance. She was wrapped in a designer cover-up that perfectly matched the high-end aesthetic of the luxury lifestyle boutique she supposedly ran. Vanessa did not say a single word, but she did not have to. She simply swirled her expensive drink, locked eyes with me across the patio, and offered a slow, incredibly smug smirk. This was the exact toxic dynamic I had been subjected to since the day I said I do. Vanessa was the sophisticated entrepreneurial ex-wife whom Patricia absolutely adored. I was the modest, quiet second wife who worked a remote, low-paying job from a small home office. They firmly believed I was a charity case. David had convinced his family, and perhaps even himself, that he had rescued me from a life of financial mediocrity. He loved playing the role of the wealthy, benevolent savior, and for 3 years I had allowed him to play it. I had kept my real life completely hidden to protect his fragile ego. I had foolishly believed that a marriage should be built on quiet love and mutual support, not power dynamics or bank account balances. I had let them all think my freelance writing work barely covered my personal groceries. I had let them think David's sprawling suburban house was my only true asset in the world. As I stood on the wet stone patio, I looked at the people surrounding me. I looked at the spoiled teenager faking tears over a spilled drink. I looked at the husband treating me like an unwanted employee who had just committed a fireable offense. I looked at the mother-in-law publicly humiliating me for entertainment. I looked at the ex-wife gloating by the pool celebrating my degradation. In that exact moment, something deep inside me finally snapped. It was not a loud or chaotic break. It was a quiet, profound, and absolute realization. I was entirely done. I was done shrinking myself to fit into their narrow, condescending view of the world. I was done pretending to be weak and dependent, just so David could feel strong and important. I had spent 3 years turning the other cheek for the sake of family harmony. I had held on to the naive belief that eventually, if I was kind enough and helpful enough, they would accept me. But looking at their sneering faces, I realized the cold truth. They never wanted a supportive wife for David or a caring stepmother for Brittany. They simply wanted a punching bag. They wanted someone they could step on to elevate their own fragile social status. I did not cry. The tears of frustration that usually pricked my eyes during these calculated family ambushes were completely absent. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to defend myself against Patricia's vicious financial insults or Brittany's dramatic lies. Instead, I looked directly into David's eyes. I saw a brief flicker of confusion pass over his features. He was waiting for my usual response. He was waiting for the quiet, frantic apologies and the desperate attempts to de-escalate the situation and restore the peace. Slowly and deliberately, I reached behind my back. I untied the strings of the floral apron I had been wearing since 6 o'clock that morning. I pulled it over my head, feeling a sudden physical weight lift from my shoulders as the fabric came off. The patio remained dead silent. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic hum of the pool filter working in the background. I folded the apron neatly, perfectly squaring the corners, and placed it down on the nearest patio table next to a platter of half-eaten appetizers I had spent hours preparing. "I will not apologize for an accident," I said. My voice was steady, clear, and rang out across the quiet yard with absolute conviction. I did not yell, but the sheer certainty in my tone made David take a half step back in surprise. "And I will not stay where I am disrespected." I did not wait for his response. I did not wait for Patricia to formulate another insult. I did not look at Brittany's face to see if her theatrical tears had stopped. I simply turned my back on all of them. My posture was perfectly straight as I walked across the patio. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone, a steady beat marking my departure. I walked through the massive sliding glass doors and stepped into the immaculate air-conditioned living room. I did not pause to look at the expensive furniture or the framed family photos that deliberately excluded me. I walked straight down the wide hallway and pushed open the heavy oak front doors of the estate. I walked down the long, winding driveway, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the barbecue completely behind me. The stunned silence from the backyard followed me all the way to my parked car. They were probably standing there in utter shock, assuming I would just cool off in my car. They likely believed I would realize I had nowhere else to go and eventually come crawling back inside to beg for David's forgiveness. They truly thought they held all the power. They thought they controlled my entire existence and dictated my worth. I unlocked my car and slipped into the driver's seat, shutting the door and enclosing myself in the quiet space. I did not feel fear or panic about where I would go or what I would do. As I pulled out of the lavish neighborhood and turned onto the main road, a cool, refreshing wave of absolute clarity washed over me. The facade was finally over. The polite, accommodating wife they thought they knew was gone, and the woman they were about to meet was someone they could never have anticipated. The heavy wrought iron gates of Patricia's subdivision faded in my rearview mirror, and with them went the suffocating weight of the last 3 years. The air conditioning in my modest sedan blasted against my face, drying the lingering sweat from a morning spent playing the dutiful, invisible servant. A typical woman in my position might have pulled over to the side of the road. She might have collapsed against the steering wheel, sobbing into her hands, overwhelmed by the vicious cruelty of her husband and his family. I did not shed a single tear. My pulse, which had been racing on the patio just minutes prior, settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The heat of humiliation vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating precision that had kept me alive and thriving long before David ever entered my life. I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburb until I reached the highway on-ramp. Once I was merged safely into the steady stream of afternoon traffic heading toward the city, I reached over to the passenger side. I popped open the glove compartment. Beneath the car manual, a stack of registration papers, and a decoy flashlight, there was a false bottom. I pressed my thumb against the small hidden latch I had installed myself. The plastic panel clicked and gave way. I pulled out a heavy matte black smartphone. It was an encrypted, highly secure device that ran on an entirely separate network. David had absolutely no idea it existed. To him, I was the woman who occasionally forgot to charge her budget-friendly Android. He did not know that this black device held the keys to an empire he could not even begin to comprehend. I pressed the power button, watching the custom boot sequence light up the screen. The interface was clean, devoid of any social media apps, games, or personal photos. It held only encrypted messaging platforms, secure banking portals, and direct lines to the board members of my actual life. I tapped the screen and initiated a secure call to a number saved simply under a single initial. The line did not even complete its first full ring before it was answered. Greg's voice came through the speaker, sharp, professional, and entirely free of the condescending tone I had grown so accustomed to hearing from David's circle. "You are calling early," Nina Gregg said. His voice was accompanied by the faint, rapid sound of typing in the background. "I assumed you would be trapped serving finger sandwiches to the country club elite until at least sundown." "I am done serving sandwiches," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the gray stretch of highway ahead. "I am done with all of it. Greg, it is time. Execute the default clause on David's property, today." The typing on the other end of the line ceased immediately. There was a brief, loaded pause as Greg processed the gravity of the instruction. "You are absolutely certain," he asked, his tone shifting from casual business banter to absolute razor-sharp focus. "Once I file this, the automated systems take over. The grace period expired 6 months ago. We can trigger the foreclosure and eviction protocols before the banks even close today. He will have zero legal recourse." "I am completely certain," I replied, my grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Push the button." It was a moment I had anticipated for a long time, though a small, foolish part of my heart had always hoped I would never have to issue the command. I had met David when my company was in its infancy, a time when I wanted a normal, quiet life to balance the intense pressure of my career. I had introduced myself as a freelance data entry clerk because it was easier than explaining the truth. The truth was that I was the founder and majority shareholder of Cipher Holdings. Cipher Holdings was not a freelance gig. It was a ruthless multi-million-dollar private equity and data forensics firm that I had built from the ground up in a tiny apartment long before I ever moved to Chicago. We specialized in acquiring distressed debts, auditing toxic financial portfolios, and liquidating assets that arrogant, over-leveraged individuals thought they could hide. While Patricia and Vanessa were mocking my supposedly cheap clothes and lack of ambition, my firm was generating 8 figures annually by dissecting the financial mistakes of people exactly like them. When David and I had married, I had kept my wealth entirely separate. I wanted him to love me, not for a bank balance. But as the years dragged on, his true nature had revealed itself. He was not a savior. He was a financially irresponsible narcissist who used my supposed poverty to keep me submissive. He loved reminding me that I lived in his beautiful house. He loved reminding me that without him, I would be nothing. What David did not know was that he did not actually own that beautiful house anymore. "I hear the smile in your silence," Greg said through the encrypted phone, pulling me back to the present moment. "I am transmitting the final authorization codes right now. The legal notices will be generated and processed within the hour. I have the couriers on standby to deliver the physical documents directly to the property. Do you want me to send a copy to his mother's house just to make a point?" "No," I said smoothly, merging into the fast lane as the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago came into view. "Send the physical folder to his house. I want it waiting on the kitchen island when he gets home." He told me to pack my bags and leave if I would not apologize to Brittany. I am going to pack everything. The house will be completely empty when he walks through the door except for that envelope. "Consider it done," Greg replied. "The printer is already running. Have you reviewed the ledger regarding his second mortgage, the one he secretly took out to fund Vanessa's vanity project?" "I have," I confirmed. The memory of discovering that particular betrayal still sent a cold spike of anger through my chest. Nearly a year ago, my firm's algorithms had flagged a distressed debt portfolio that a major regional bank was looking to offload. I had reviewed the file personally, only to find my own husband's name buried in the paperwork. David had quietly leveraged the equity of the home we lived in to secure a massive loan. He had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into Vanessa's luxury boutique, a business that was hemorrhaging money and facing imminent bankruptcy. He had not consulted me. He had not even mentioned it. He simply gambled the roof over my head to play the hero for his ex-wife. When he inevitably defaulted on the payments 6 months ago, the bank had panicked. Cipher Holdings swept in and purchased the debt for pennies on the dollar. I had legally owned his house, his debt, and his entire financial future for half a year, sitting quietly across the table from him while he lectured me about fiscal responsibility. I watched the entire sequence of their return unfold in flawless, crystal-clear high definition. From the sleek monitors in my downtown office, I had access to the comprehensive security system I had installed in the house 2 years prior. David always thought the cameras were an unnecessary luxury, but he never bothered to learn how they worked or who controlled the master administration rights. 4 hours had passed since I walked out of Patricia's sweltering backyard. The sun was just beginning to dip lower in the late afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the pristine driveway of the suburban estate. The heavy luxury SUV finally pulled through the gates and parked near the front steps. Brittany stepped out of the passenger side first. She was holding her phone high in the air, the camera angled perfectly to capture her face, and the sprawling architecture of the house behind her. I turned up the audio feed on my terminal to listen to her broadcast. She was already mid-sentence performing for her unseen audience of online followers. She tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder and adopted a tone of exaggerated mocking sympathy. "So guys, we are just getting back from my grandmother's epic summer party," she said to her phone, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "And let me tell you, the drama was absolutely unreal today. My toxic stepmother completely lost her mind because I accidentally stepped into her path. She literally tried to ruin the entire barbecue over 3 drops of iced tea. My dad finally put her in her place and told her to leave. We are about to walk inside and see if she actually packed her cheap bags, or if she is just sitting in the living room crying and waiting to beg for forgiveness. David slammed his car door shut, adjusting the collar of his expensive polo shirt. He looked to be incredibly self-satisfied. He marched up the front steps with the arrogant stride of a man completely convinced of his own manufactured authority. He did not look worried. He did not look like a husband whose wife had just walked out on him in a very public display of defiance. He looked like an irritated boss preparing to formally discipline an unruly subordinate. He pushed his thumb against the biometric lock on the front door, and the heavy wood swung open with a soft click. I watched through the entryway camera as they stepped into the foyer. David immediately puffed out his chest and raised his voice, fully expecting me to come scurrying out of the kitchen or the study to apologize. "Nina," he called out. The sound of his voice echoed off the high ceilings. The echo was noticeably louder than usual, a sharp bouncing acoustic that immediately made David frown. "I hope you have spent the last 4 hours thinking about your ridiculous behavior today. Come out here right now. We are going to have a very serious conversation about the way you disrespected my daughter and my mother in front of all of our friends." There was absolutely no response. The house was perfectly eerily silent. Brittany followed him inside, still holding her phone up, panning the camera around the entryway to capture what she thought would be my humiliating defeat. "Well, she is probably hiding upstairs," Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes for the camera lens. "She knows she is in massive trouble and is too scared to face us." But as David stepped further into the grand foyer, his confident stride faltered. He stopped dead in his tracks, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Something was fundamentally wrong with the space, though it took his arrogant mind a few seconds to process exactly what it was. The entryway floor felt strangely bare. The heavy antique hand-woven Persian runner that usually stretched from the front door to the main living area was completely gone. He looked up at the walls. The custom-framed original artwork I had curated from local galleries over the past 3 years had vanished. In their place were only blank pale walls and small metal picture hooks casting long shadows in the afternoon light. "Nina," David yelled again, a distinct edge of frustration creeping into his tone. "Where are you? Why is the hallway empty? What kind of childish tantrum are you trying to pull right now? Where did you put the paintings?" He marched past the staircase and turned into the main living room. Brittany followed close behind him, her phone still recording, though her running commentary had abruptly stopped. The living room camera captured their simultaneous realization. The space looked completely hollowed out. While David's heavy leather sofas and his massive television remained, everything that gave the room life and warmth was gone. The silk throw pillows, the cashmere blankets, the imported ceramic vases, and the towering indoor plants I had painstakingly maintained were simply missing. It was as if a surgical strike team had entered the home and extracted every single trace of my existence, without disturbing a single piece of David's personal property. "What on earth is she doing?" David muttered, his hands resting on his hips. He spun around and stormed up the main staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. I switched my monitor to the camera positioned in the upstairs hallway. He shoved open the double doors to the master suite and disappeared inside. I did not have cameras in the bedroom or the bathroom to protect my own privacy, but I did not need them to know exactly what he was finding. He was finding a perfectly clean, empty space. My entire side of the expansive walk-in closet was entirely bare. The hundreds of designer garments, the bespoke suits, the expensive shoes he never realized the true value of were all packed away. My vanity was wiped clean of every perfume bottle and makeup brush. My jewelry box was gone. I had hired a premium, highly discreet moving service the exact moment I stepped out of Patricia's gate. They were efficient, silent, and incredibly thorough. Downstairs, Brittany was standing in the center of the living room. She finally lowered her phone, the realization dawning on her face that this was not a simple temper tantrum. She walked over to the long mantel above the fireplace. The silver-framed photographs of our wedding, the candid shots from our vacations, the small trinkets I had collected from our travels were all gone. The only photo left on the mantel was an older picture of David and Brittany from before I had ever entered the picture. It was as if the last 3 years had been physically erased from the property in a matter of hours. David came rushing back down the staircase. His face was flushed bright red, and his breathing was heavy and labored. "She actually packed her things," he said to Brittany, his voice a mixture of sheer disbelief and rising panic. "She emptied her entire side of the closet and took everything from the bathroom." He stormed into the sprawling gourmet kitchen. The massive granite kitchen island, usually a hub of activity and warmth, was completely cleared off. It was cleared off except for one single item. Sitting dead center on the cold, polished stone surface was a thick, heavy manila folder waiting to be opened by his trembling hands. It was the end of his perfect life, quietly waiting for his total ruin to finally begin right here, right now. David snatched his smartphone from his pocket. He did not bother to open the folder yet. He tapped my name on his screen and slammed his finger against the speakerphone icon. He threw the phone down on the granite island next to the envelope. Brittany stepped closer, holding her camera steady, eagerly awaiting the sound of my tearful apologies. She wanted to capture my humiliation for her followers. The phone rang twice before I answered. I was sitting in my corner office, perfectly calm. "You think throwing a tantrum and packing a bag scares me?" David barked. "You have nowhere to go. You live in my house. Come back right now, apologize to my daughter, and beg me not to divorce you." I let his arrogant words echo through the quiet space of my office. I could hear Brittany snickering in the background. "Are you finished, David?" I asked. My voice was ice-cold, void of the submission he was accustomed to hearing. I did not sound like the subservient wife he thought he controlled. I sounded like the executive I truly was. David scoffed loudly. "Do not use that tone with me. I am giving you exactly 1 hour to get your car back in my driveway before I change the locks. Open the manila folder on the island," I said smoothly, entirely ignoring his pathetic ultimatum, "and turn to page 3. There was a moment of thick hesitation on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of paper as David's curiosity overpowered his posturing. He grabbed the heavy envelope, tore the flap open, and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The top sheet bore the embossed seal of the state of Illinois alongside the modern logo of Cipher Holdings. I heard the sharp intake of his breath as his eyes scanned the capitalized letters at the top of the first page. "What is this nonsense?" David demanded, though his voice had lost a significant fraction of its bravado. "Notice of foreclosure. This is a joke. You printed out fake legal documents to try and scare me. You are completely out of your mind." "Turn to page 3, David," I repeated calmly. "Read the financial breakdown. Read the figures aloud." I heard the frantic shuffling of paper as he flipped past the cover pages. Then the line went dead silent. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a detailed accounting of the massive second mortgage he had secretly taken out on our primary residence 18 months ago. He was looking at the routing numbers showing where the funds had been transferred. Every single dollar had been funneled directly into Vanessa's luxury lifestyle boutique. "You hit it very well for the first year," I told him. "You made the minimum payments by draining your personal savings and cashing out your stock portfolios. You thought you were clever playing the wealthy savior for Vanessa while I sat across from you oblivious. But your liquid assets dried up, David. You have not made a single payment on that second mortgage in exactly 6 months. You snooped through my private mail," David sputtered, his voice rising in genuine panic. "You hacked into my bank accounts. This is illegal. I will have you arrested for this." "I did not hack anything," I replied. When a borrower defaults on a high-risk loan for 6 consecutive months, the regional banks panic. They do not want toxic assets polluting their quarterly reports, so they bundle those bad loans up and sell them off to private equity firms at a steep discount. Your bank sold your debt. "So what?" David yelled. I could hear Brittany shifting nervously. "So a private firm bought the debt. I will call them on Monday morning. I will restructure the payments. My mother will write a check and pay off the arrears. You think you have uncovered some massive conspiracy, but it is just a temporary cash flow problem. You know absolutely nothing about the real world of finance." "I know everything," I said softly, delivering the final blow. "The private equity firm that purchased your distressed debt is called Cipher Holdings. Look at the signature of the chief executive officer at the very bottom of page 3. I listened intently as his eyes scanned the document. I could practically picture the exact moment his gaze landed on my signature. The wealthy facade he had maintained his entire adult life was shattering into pieces. No. David breathed out, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly small. No, this is impossible. You are a freelance data entry clerk. You barely earn enough to cover your own expenses. I am the founder and sole owner of Cipher Holdings, I stated flatly. I built that firm from nothing long before I met you. I hid my wealth because I wanted a marriage based on love and equality. But you could not handle equality. You needed someone to look down on. You needed a maid you could parade in front of your mother and your ex-wife. And while you were busy treating me like dirt, my algorithms flagged your spectacular financial failures. Nina, please, David stammered, the anger vanishing, replaced by a cold, crawling terror. We can talk about this. You are my wife. We can fix this. You do not own that house anymore, David. I continued, ignoring his pathetic plea. You gambled our home to save Vanessa's failing business, and you lost. I own your debt. I own the deed. As the chief executive of the firm that holds your foreclosed mortgage, I am liquidating the asset immediately. You and Brittany have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property before the sheriff's department arrives to physically remove you. Brittany's voice finally broke through the tense silence on the call. Her tone was no longer mocking. It was laced with genuine dread. Dad, what is she talking about? What does that paper say? She asked, her voice trembling. Dad, tell me she is lying. We are not losing the house right. Grandma will fix it. David did not answer his daughter. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound, staring at the manila folder. The paper represented the total annihilation of his ego, wealth, and reality. He had demanded that I apologize or leave. He had thrown me away like trash, fully believing I would be destitute without him. Now the overwhelming reality was crushing him. I was not the freeloader, he was. 48 hours, David. I repeated, my voice devoid of any sympathy or regret. I suggest you stop yelling at me and start packing your bags. Without waiting for him to formulate another desperate lie, I reached out and tapped the red button on my screen. The line went dead. The silence in my office was a beautiful contrast to the absolute chaos erupting back in the suburbs. I placed the phone down on my polished desk. I swiveled my chair toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat in my quiet office watching the city lights begin to flicker on in the early evening dusk, feeling completely untouchable and entirely free. I tapped my keyboard, waking the monitors. The security feeds from the suburban house filled the screens. David stared at his phone on the granite island. The call had ended, but he stood completely frozen. The only sound in the empty kitchen was the hum of the refrigerator. Then the nervous laughter began. It started as a low chuckle before erupting into a forced bark. He shook his head violently, running a hand through his hair. He grabbed the manila folder, flipping through the pages with reckless aggression. Brittany remained near the doorway. The camera caught the fear tightening her features. She looked at her father as if waiting for him to make the nightmare stop. "This is a bluff," David announced to the empty room. His voice was too loud. "It is an elaborate, pathetic bluff. She actually went through the trouble of printing fake legal documents to try and scare us." Brittany stepped closer. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking, "that seal looks incredibly real. It has a state watermark, and those account numbers are those your actual bank accounts. How would she even know those routing numbers?" David snatched the papers away. "I told you she is a data entry clerk. She probably found an old bank statement in my office and used some cheap software to generate this garbage." He slammed the folder back down. "You think throwing a tantrum and packing a bag scares me?" he yelled at the ceiling. "You have nowhere to go. You live in my house." He picked up his smartphone to dial my number again. On my desk, the secure device remained dark. I had already disconnected the routing number. He could dial it 1,000 times and only get an out-of-service message. David pulled the device away from his ear, his face growing redder by the second. "She blocked me," he muttered, throwing the phone down. He paced. "She thinks this is a game. She thinks she can humiliate my mother, disrespect my daughter, and then pretend to be a corporate titan. I am going to destroy her. Dad, what are we going to do? Brittany asked. She stared toward the empty living room, finally grasping the reality that her comfortable existence was evaporating. My friends are coming over tomorrow afternoon for a pool party. I cannot have them see the house looking like this. Where is all the furniture? Where are the custom rugs and paintings? David stopped pacing. He took a deep breath, visibly attempting to gather his shattered pride. We are not doing anything, he said smoothly, because there is absolutely nothing to worry about. Even if she somehow stumbled onto a real debt portfolio, even if this Cipher Holdings company actually exists, it is just a temporary cash flow issue. She is a broke freelancer trying to play in a major league she does not understand. He picked up his phone again. I am calling your grandmother right now, David told Brittany. My mother will just write a check to this imaginary company and buy the house back tomorrow morning. We will pay off whatever arrears Nina thinks she owns, and then I am filing for divorce and suing her for emotional distress. She will be paying my legal fees for the next 20 years. He placed the phone on speaker. The line rang 3 times before Patricia answered. Her voice was laced with irritation. David, please tell me you have handled that ungrateful woman. I am still fielding calls from the country club asking why she caused a scene and stormed out of my backyard. It was utterly humiliating. I am handling it, Mother David said, but she pulled a massive stunt. She hired a moving company while we were at your house. She completely emptied her belongings. And she left a fake foreclosure notice on the kitchen island. She is claiming she owns the second mortgage on the house. There was a sharp gasp. A foreclosure notice, Patricia demanded, her voice rising. David, what second mortgage? You told me you paid off the house 5 years ago. I watched David wince. He rubbed the back of his neck, realizing he now had to confess his financial mismanagement. I took out a small equity line a while back to help Vanessa with some business expenses, he admitted. It was just a temporary bridge loan. Apparently, the bank sold the debt to a private equity firm, Cipher Holdings, and Nina is claiming she is the owner of the firm. She is demanding we vacate the property in 48 hours. Patricia let out a harsh laugh. Nina, a private equity CEO. David, the woman clips coupons for laundry detergent. This is clearly a pathetic extortion attempt. She is trying to scare you into a massive divorce settlement because she knows she has absolutely nothing to her name. That is exactly what I told Brittany, David said, his shoulders dropping in sheer relief. But the document has a state seal. I need to make this go away quietly before the neighbors start asking questions. I need you to write a check to cover the arrears tomorrow morning. We will squash this fake company, pay off the balance, and then I will have my lawyers completely ruin her. Consider it done, Patricia said quickly. I will transfer funds from my primary investment account tomorrow. I am calling Richard right now. He is the best real estate attorney in Chicago. I will have him draft a cease and desist order so terrifying that little gold digger will not even dare to show her face in this state again. We are going to crush her, David. She picked the wrong family to cross. David thanked his mother profusely and ended the call. He looked at Brittany with a triumphant smirk, all of his previous panic completely erased by the promise of his mother's money. I told you, he said, tapping the manila folder. It is handled. Let her enjoy her little fantasy tonight. Tomorrow she goes back to being a broke data entry clerk. I sat in my office and smiled softly at the security monitor. David was entirely predictable. He always ran to his mother to fix his messes, relying heavily on her generational wealth to shield him from the consequences of his own staggering arrogance. He truly believed Patricia's bank accounts were a bottomless well of salvation. I reached across my desk and pulled up the financial dossiers I had compiled over the last 3 years. I opened Patricia's file. David did not know that his mother's primary investment accounts were leveraged in commercial real estate. He did not know that her portfolio had taken massive undisclosed losses during the last market downturn. He did not know a significant portion of her remaining liquid assets were tied up in a municipal bond fund that Cipher Holdings had aggressively shorted 2 weeks ago. I opened a chat window to Greg. I typed a brief command, Patricia is going to attempt a wire transfer tomorrow morning to clear the second mortgage arrears. I want an immediate freeze placed on the property title. Refuse all incoming payments. State that the asset is already in active liquidation. Greg's reply appeared on my screen seconds later. He confirmed the order with a simple acknowledgement. I leaned back in my chair, sipping a glass of cold water. Tomorrow morning, Patricia was going to walk into her bank demand to write a massive check to save her son and discover that her own accounts lacked the liquidity to cover his massive debt. The financial trap I had built was inescapable, and they were walking right into the center of it. While I sat in my office, the atmosphere back in the suburban estate shifted from panic to calculated malice. David had convinced himself that his mother's wealth was an impenetrable shield. He poured himself a glass of scotch, ignoring the reality of the foreclosure document just inches away. Brittany, however, possessed a different survival instinct. She understood that controlling the narrative was paramount. She knew people would notice my absence. She needed to paint herself as the victim before anyone could ask questions. Brittany propped her phone against a marble fruit bowl. She adjusted her ring light, ensuring the glare illuminated the empty spaces in the background. She rubbed the skin under her eyes until it turned a blotchy red, practicing a tremor in her lower lip. Satisfied with her battered appearance, she pressed record. "Hey guys," Brittany began, her voice a fragile whisper. "I usually keep my family life private, but I had to get on here because I am completely devastated. I am shaking right now. I just got home to find that my stepmother has abandoned us. She packed up all her expensive things and vanished." She let a perfectly timed tear slide down her cheek, wiping it away with her sleeve. "For 3 years I tried so hard to love her," Brittany continued, staring into the lens. "I tried to welcome her into our home, but she was emotionally abusive behind closed doors. She constantly told me I was worthless when my dad was not around. We just found out she has been secretly funneling my dad's hard-earned money into her private accounts. She stole from us, and now she is trying to throw us out on the street to cover her tracks. Please send good vibes. We need a miracle to recover from the damage this toxic woman has done." She hit stop, reviewed the footage, and uploaded it across her social platforms. She tagged the country club, her private school, and prominent community pages to ensure maximum visibility. Within minutes, the algorithm caught the emotional content. The video began to spread through the wealthy neighborhood like a wildfire. I watched the upload from my secure terminal. My tracking software alerted me the moment my name was mentioned in connection with Brittany's accounts. I analyzed her performance. It was a masterful piece of fiction, completely devoid of truth, but packed with enough manipulation to incite immediate outrage. Brittany knew exactly what she was doing. She was rallying their community to form a protective wall around her family. Half an hour after the video went live, my old Android device began to vibrate violently on the corner of my desk. I had kept the phone powered on specifically to monitor the fallout. The screen lit up with a relentless barrage of incoming messages. I unlocked the device. The notifications were a cascading waterfall of pure venom. The first message was from Linda, head of the Homeowners Association. "I cannot believe we let a common thief into our book club. You belong in a prison cell, not our neighborhood. Do not ever show your face at the clubhouse again." Below that was a message from Sarah, a woman I had helped organize charity drives. "You absolute monster. How could you abuse a sweet girl like Brittany and steal from David? We all knew you were a broke gold digger, but this is a new low. We are contacting the authorities." The messages poured in from PTA mothers, local business owners, and mutual acquaintances who eagerly swallowed Brittany's tearful lies. Some contained direct threats of physical violence. Others promised to hire private investigators to drag me back to face justice. They called me a parasite, a criminal, and a sociopath. They rallied around David as the tragic hero duped by a grifter. I read through the vile messages with complete emotional detachment. I did not feel the sting of rejection or the panic of being despised. Instead, I felt a profound sense of validation. These were the people who had looked down on me for 3 years. These were the people who sneered at my modest clothing and assumed my quiet demeanor was a sign of weakness. Their rapid, vicious turn against me only proved exactly how shallow and hypocritical their entire world truly was. They eagerly embraced a teenager's fabricated video as absolute gospel. While my phone continued to vibrate with hateful threats, the security cameras at the house captured the next phase of the family's defensive strategy. The oak front doors swung open, and Patricia swept into the foyer, flanked closely by Vanessa. They had rushed over the moment they saw the video, eager to participate in the destruction of my character. Patricia sprinted into the living room, wrapping Brittany in a tight embrace. "Oh, my sweet, brave girl," Patricia cooed, smoothing Brittany's hair. "I saw your video. You were so strong to speak your truth. We are going to protect you. That vile woman is never going to hurt this family again." Vanessa crossed her arms, surveying the empty living room with satisfied disgust. "I always told you she was a rat," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with superiority. "I told you she was just using you for a free ride. She thought she could sneak away with your assets, but she is entirely out of her depth." David leaned against the kitchen island, swirling his scotch. "She thinks she has cornered us," he sneered, pointing to the manila folder. "She sent over fake foreclosure documents claiming she owns the house now. She is trying to pretend she runs a massive equity firm. It is the most pathetic display of desperation I have ever seen." Vanessa laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "A private equity firm, Nina. She cannot even afford to pay for professional manicures. She is trying to scare you into walking away from the assets. We need to hit her back with everything we have. I will call my attorneys tomorrow. We will freeze whatever bank accounts she has and file a massive defamation suit for the emotional damage she has caused Brittany." Patricia nodded vigorously. "Exactly. Tomorrow morning I'm going to the bank to clear up this ridiculous second mortgage issue. Once the house is secure, we are going to bury her. I want her completely destroyed, David. I want her begging for scraps on the street. I want everyone in Chicago to know exactly what kind of manipulative thief she is." They stood together in the hollowed-out living room, a united front of arrogance and entitlement. They plotted my total ruin with gleeful enthusiasm, sharing theories about how quickly I would crumble under their combined attacks. They patted each other on the back, convinced of their own untouchable supremacy. I watched them celebrate their imaginary victory on my high-definition monitors. They were so blinded by their own superiority that they could not see the massive wave preparing to crash down on their heads. They thought they controlled the board. They thought they had the power, money, and influence to crush me into dust. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. Their confidence lasted only a few minutes. I kept the security feed active, watching the suburban pantomime unfold. Watching the suburban pantomime unfold. David poured a heavy measure of scotch for himself and handed a glass of wine to his mother. They toasted to my imminent demise, the clinking of crystal echoing through the microphone hidden in the kitchen. Patricia was already planning how she would redecorate the master bedroom once I was out of the picture. Vanessa chimed in with suggestions for expensive Italian linens, completely ignoring the fact that she was currently standing in a house facing immediate liquidation. David set his glass down on the granite counter with a heavy thud. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, a sudden spark of malicious inspiration lighting up his face. He looked at Patricia and Vanessa, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He announced that dealing with the house tomorrow was not enough. He wanted to make sure I suffered tonight. He reminded them that I supposedly worked for a small, struggling freelance data entry agency. He had seen the company name on a tax document I had purposefully left on the kitchen desk months ago. He decided he was going to call my boss. I watched David navigate his phone browser, searching for Apex Data Solutions. He did not know that Apex was merely a corporate shell, a dummy corporation set up by my chief legal counsel, Greg, to handle my low-level administrative cover story. The phone number listed on the generic website routed directly to a dedicated line on Greg's secure desk. David tapped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear, switching it to speakerphone so his audience could appreciate his ruthlessness. The line rang twice before clicking over to the automated voicemail. Greg had recorded the generic greeting himself, using a bored nasal tone to sound exactly like a tired mid-level manager. David waited for the beep and then began his performance. His voice dropped into a register of supreme condescending authority. He identified himself, making sure to emphasize his corporate title and his connections within the Chicago business community. He then launched into a completely fabricated tirade. He stated that his estranged wife Nina was currently undergoing a severe mental health crisis. He claimed I was unstable, dangerous, and attempting to extort his family using forged financial documents. Brittany walked into the kitchen holding her phone to her chest, watching her father with wide, admiring eyes. David leaned into the performance, pacing the length of the kitchen island. He told the imaginary director that keeping an employee like me was a massive liability. He demanded that I be terminated immediately. He did not stop there. He let his ego take the wheel, steering him right into actionable legal threats. He warned the voicemail that if I was not fired by the start of the next business day, he would unleash his legal team on Apex Data Solutions. He promised to sue the agency into the ground, ruin their commercial reputation, and ensure they never secured another corporate contract in the state of Illinois. He claimed he had the power to make the agency director personally destitute if he chose to harbor a thief. He ended the call with a smug, satisfied click. He tossed the phone back onto the counter, looking around the room for validation. Patricia clapped her hands together, beaming with absolute maternal pride. She praised his decisive action, calling him a true protector of the family name. Vanessa poured him another drink, complimenting his aggressive tactics. They genuinely believed he had just dealt the killing blow to my livelihood. They thought he had stripped away my only source of income, leaving me entirely dependent on their mercy. Brittany approached the island, her tears from the viral video completely gone. She asked her father if I was going to be homeless now. David chuckled, taking a long sip of his scotch. He assured his daughter that I would be begging to come back by tomorrow afternoon, desperate for a roof over my head. He promised Brittany that when I finally crawled back to apologize, he would make me clean the entire house from top to bottom before he formally served me with divorce papers. Patricia added that I needed to be taught a permanent lesson about my place in the social hierarchy. She told Brittany not to worry about the hateful messages flooding my phone. She insisted that the community needed to know the truth about the dangerous woman who had tried to infiltrate their elite circle. They stood together in the kitchen, a picture of affluent solidarity, completely intoxicated by their own fabricated superiority. They were so busy congratulating themselves that they completely ignored the very real foreclosure notice still sitting quietly on the counter. Back in my quiet, expansive office, my primary monitor chimed with an incoming encrypted message. It was an email from Greg. The subject line simply read, "Urgent audio file. Listen immediately." I clicked the attachment. The crisp audio of David's voice filled my office. Greg's secure line recorded everything with pristine clarity. I listened to my husband construct his web of lies, his threats echoing through the premium speakers on my desk. He had just handed me a golden ticket. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Greg's direct line. He answered on the first ring, a low chuckle escaping before he even said hello. I told him David was performing exactly as predicted. Greg agreed, noting the sheer arrogance required to leave a recorded threat of tortious interference and extortion on a corporate voicemail. Greg explained that by threatening to destroy a business if they did not terminate an employee, David had just crossed a very serious legal line. We discussed the implications. David was already facing the total liquidation of his primary residence and the implosion of his mother's financial portfolio. Now he had provided undeniable recorded proof of his attempts to sabotage my employment through malicious defamation. Greg informed me that he was immediately adding the recording to our growing legal arsenal. He was preparing the documentation to file a massive civil suit for tortious interference, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were going to attach the recording to the public filing, ensuring that David's arrogant threats became a matter of permanent public record. I asked Greg if he had preserved the metadata from the call. He confirmed that he had captured the origin number, the exact timestamp, and the audio fingerprint, rendering the evidence absolutely bulletproof. There would be no way for David's high-priced attorneys to argue that the voicemail was a fake or a manipulation. I thanked Greg and ended the call. I slowly swiveled my chair back toward the security monitors. David was now sitting on the leather sofa in the living room, laughing loudly at a joke Vanessa had just made. He looked so incredibly relaxed, utterly confident that he had secured his wealthy lifestyle and destroyed my meager existence. He did not realize that he had just handed me the very weapon I would use to legally annihilate him. Morning broke over the affluent Chicago suburbs with crisp sunlight. Patricia woke feeling profound purpose. She dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit and signature pearls. Today she would put an arrogant data entry clerk in her place. She poured a cup of black coffee, her mind moving past David's blunder. Money was the ultimate eraser of problems. A swift transfer would clear the debt and pave the way for a ruthless offensive. She picked up her handbag and walked out to her waiting car. The drive downtown took 45 minutes. Patricia directed her driver to pull up to the gleaming facade of First Sterling Bank, catering exclusively to high-net-worth individuals. Patricia had been a priority client here for 3 decades. She walked through the revolving doors with the practiced stride of a woman who owned the room. The branch manager, an impeccably groomed man named Thomas, spotted her immediately. He stepped out to greet her with a deferential smile. "Good morning, Patricia. How can we assist you today?" he asked, gesturing toward his private suite. Patricia took a seat opposite his desk. "I need to initiate a priority wire transfer immediately," she stated. "My son has entangled himself with a predatory lending firm. I need to clear an outstanding mortgage balance before noon. The firm is called Cipher Holdings. I have the routing information right here." She slid heavy cardstock across the polished mahogany desk. Thomas nodded, waking his computer terminal. "Certainly, Patricia. We can expedite that right away. Which account would you like to draw the funds from?" "Take it from the primary municipal bond portfolio," she replied. "The amount is roughly $400,000. Just clear the entire arrears and pay the penalty fees. I want this nuisance eliminated by lunchtime." Thomas began typing the transaction details into the system. Patricia sat back, anticipating the phone call she would make to David. She imagined the sheer panic on Nina's face when the bank notified her the debt had been wiped out. The thought brought a satisfied smile to her lips. Then the rhythmic clicking of Thomas's keyboard abruptly stopped. Patricia watched as his professional expression faltered. A deep crease formed between his eyebrows. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the screen. He hit the refresh key and sat back with a look of profound confusion. "Is there a problem?" Thomas, Patricia asked, her voice laced with sudden irritation. "I do not have all day." "There seems to be an error with the routing process," Thomas murmured, losing his confident timbre. "The system is rejecting the transfer. Let me try pulling the funds from your secondary liquid asset trust. Sometimes bond portfolios require a holding period for large transfers." Patricia sighed loudly. "Just get it done. I do not care which account you use. Move the money and give me the confirmation receipt." Thomas nodded quickly, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The silence in the office stretched out, becoming heavy. Patricia checked her watch, her patience evaporating. After another minute, Thomas slowly pulled his hands away. His face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks. "Patricia," he started, his voice barely more than a dry whisper. "I cannot authorize the transfer. I cannot access the secondary trust either." Patricia slammed her hand down on the armrest. "What do you mean you cannot access it? I have millions of dollars sitting in this bank. Are you telling me your entire system is down? I will call the regional director right now and have you replaced." Thomas shook his head, refusing to meet her eyes. "It is not a system error, Patricia. Your accounts, all of your accounts, they are frozen." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Patricia stared at him, her mind rejecting the information. "Frozen. Do not be absurd. I am a Tier 1 client. You do not freeze my accounts. What is this, some kind of automated security flag? Fix it immediately." Thomas swallowed hard. He turned his monitor around so Patricia could see the screen. The display was covered in glaring red text blocking out her account balances. The words, "Administrative Hold Federal Compliance Order," blinked aggressively in the center. "This is not an internal security flag," Thomas explained, his voice trembling. "This is a hard lock initiated by our Federal Compliance Division. Your portfolios have been flagged for catastrophic margin calls. The commercial real estate leverage tied to your primary accounts has collapsed, and your municipal bond fund has suffered a massive short." Patricia stared at the red text, her breath catching in her throat. The invincible armor she had worn her entire life was cracking. "What are you talking about?" "Margin calls. I have a conservative growth portfolio. My broker assured me those investments were insulated from market volatility." Thomas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "The market shifted drastically 48 hours ago. A private equity firm took a massive short position against your specific municipal bond sector. At the same time, the commercial properties you leveraged as collateral were reassessed and significantly devalued. The bank initiated automatic margin calls to cover the shortfall, but the liquidity simply is not there." Patricia's chest tightened. A cold, suffocating dread began to creep up her spine. She thought of David sitting in his empty house waiting for her money. She thought of the confident promises she had made to him and Brittany just hours ago. What private equity firm, she demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "What firm shorted my bonds?" Thomas clicked his mouse, opening a compliance subfolder. He scanned the fine print, his eyes widening in shock. The primary short position was executed by a firm called Cipher Holdings. The name hit Patricia like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. The room began to spin. Cipher Holdings, the imaginary company David had laughed about. The fake entity Nina had supposedly invented to scare them. It was real. It was real, and it had just annihilated her entire financial existence. "You need to override this," Patricia gasped, gripping the edge of the desk. Her carefully cultivated composure was completely gone. "You need to call the compliance office right now and tell them there has been a mistake. I need those funds released. I need to pay my son's mortgage." "I cannot do that," Patricia Thomas said gently, pity replacing his professional deference. "The accounts are locked. As of this morning, your net liquidity is negative. The bank will be seizing your remaining liquid assets to cover the margin debt. You do not have the funds to wire $400,000. You do not have the funds to wire $10. Patricia sat frozen in the plush leather chair. The reality of her situation crushed down on her with the weight of a collapsing building. The immense wealth that had defined her identity, her power and her superiority, was gone. It had been systematically dismantled and locked away by the very woman she had spent years treating like dirt. She had walked into the bank as a queen. She was walking out a beggar at the mercy of the daughter-in-law she tried to destroy. I closed the surveillance window on my monitor just as a sharp double knock echoed through the quiet space of my office. Greg pushed open the frosted glass door, carrying a thick stack of rigid black binders under his left arm. He wore a crisp charcoal suit, completely unbothered by the fact that we had both been awake since 3 in the morning, finalizing the morning's operational sequence. He walked over to the expansive mahogany desk and dropped the heavy binders onto the polished surface. They landed with a satisfying, authoritative thud that resonated through the quiet room. Greg tapped the uppermost binder rather than repeating the scene I had already followed through the compliance dashboard. "Patricia has left First Sterling," he said. "The federal hold remained in place, and the bank refused every attempt to move funds. She has already called David, so he now knows she cannot rescue the property." He paused before sliding the binder toward me. "The transfer failure is no longer the important part. The bank's mandatory review exposed transactions connected to the commercial real estate fund inherited from Arthur. Those records match the discrepancies our acquisition team identified last month. We now have an independently verified trail showing inflated collateral, concealed liabilities, and years of questionable transfers." "Has anything been altered or moved since the lock was imposed?" I asked. "No. The preservation order stopped all outgoing transactions before Patricia reached the branch. The authorities, not Cipher Holdings, control the freeze. Our role now is to preserve the original records and cooperate with the audit." That distinction mattered. Patricia would undoubtedly claim I had emptied her accounts with the push of a button. The evidence showed something far less dramatic, and far more damaging. Her fortune had collapsed under obligations and irregularities that existed long before I examined it. I reached forward and pulled the top binder toward me. It contained the forensic accounting reports we had commissioned when Cipher Holdings first began looking into the distressed commercial real estate fund that held the bulk of Patricia's wealth. I flipped open the cover, staring at the dense spreadsheets and highlighted discrepancies. It is almost tragic how deeply she believed in her own financial invulnerability, I said, tracing a finger down a column of red figures. She spent decades looking down on people who actually worked for a living, fully convinced that her late husband had left her an impenetrable fortress of wealth. She never bothered to look under the floorboards. Greg unbuttoned his suit jacket and crossed his legs, adopting a more relaxed posture. Arthur was a remarkably sloppy architect, he noted, referring to David's deceased father. When Cipher Holdings acquired the managing interest in the commercial real estate fund last month, we expected to find standard market depreciation. The retail sector took a hit, and we anticipated managing a few underwater properties. We did not expect to find a massive interconnected web of compliance violations and federal tax fraud. I turned the page, looking at the structural diagrams Greg's team had built. Arthur had been moving money through a series of shell companies for over 2 decades. He had artificially inflated the value of his commercial properties to secure massive loans, which he then funneled into high-yield, high-risk municipal bonds. He used the dividends to fund Patricia's lavish lifestyle, paying off the minimum balances on the loans, and hiding the mounting debt through creative accounting. It was a classic, unsustainable house of cards. When Arthur passed away, the structure was already rotting from the inside out. Patricia had inherited the entire mess. Instead of liquidating assets or conducting a proper audit of the estate, she had simply continued to live off the toxic dividends. She assumed the money would flow forever. She assumed the properties would always hold their inflated value. She never asked questions, because the answers might have required her to sacrifice her country club memberships and designer wardrobes. I want to be completely clear on our exposure, I said, looking up at Greg. David and Patricia are going to claim that I orchestrated this freeze out of spite. They are going to tell anyone who will listen that I hacked their accounts or maliciously locked their money to punish them. Greg shook his head, offering a reassuring professional smile. They can claim whatever they want, Nina. The paper trail is absolute. You did not initiate the freeze. Cipher Holdings simply acted as a responsible acquiring entity. When our analysts uncovered the massive discrepancies in the commercial fund, you ordered a standard legal audit. Once the audit revealed active decades-long tax fraud and federal compliance violations, we were legally obligated to turn that forensic data over to the authorities. We handed the files to the federal compliance officers and the Internal Revenue Service. Greg continued, his voice steady and precise. The feds are the ones who initiated the hard lock on Patricia's accounts. They froze the assets to prevent capital flight while they investigate the extent of Arthur's fraudulent loans. You did not press a magic button to ruin your mother-in-law. You simply did your job as a chief executive. You shined a light in a dark room, and the authorities reacted to the cockroaches they saw scattering. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of Greg's words settle over me. It was a vital distinction. For 3 years, Patricia had treated me like a parasite, openly wondering why David had married someone with no financial pedigree. She had mocked my modest car, my lack of designer labels, and my quiet demeanor. She genuinely believed her wealth made her superior. Yet her entire existence was funded by phantom money and illegal leverage. The irony is staggering, I murmured, closing the binder. She spent her entire life judging people for not working hard enough while she sat on a throne built of stolen money and fraudulent collateral. If Arthur had just been honest, if he had built a legitimate portfolio, they might have survived the market downturn. But because the foundation was entirely rotten, a single margin call triggered a total systemic collapse. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The commercial properties were reassessed last week by independent federal auditors. Once the true market value was established, the loans were immediately called in. Patricia's liquid assets are going to be seized to cover the massive shortfall. By the time the federal authorities finish untangling Arthur's tax liabilities and the associated penalties, there will be absolutely nothing left. She will be lucky to avoid criminal negligence charges herself, depending on what she signed when she took over the estate. I processed the sheer magnitude of the devastation. I had originally intended to simply force David to face the reality of his own poor choices regarding the second mortgage. I wanted him to lose the house he had gambled away on Vanessa's failing boutique. But uncovering Patricia's fraudulent empire had been a completely unexpected byproduct of standard corporate acquisition. It was not a targeted assassination. It was a structural demolition. "Does David have any idea?" I asked, tapping a pen against the desk. He was so confident on the security feed. He truly believes his mother is going to wire the funds today and save him. "David is functionally illiterate when it comes to high-level finance," Greg replied smoothly. "He understands how to spend money, but he has absolutely no concept of how it is generated or protected. He likely assumed his father's trust was an endless magical fountain. When Patricia calls him to explain that the bank turned her away, he will not comprehend the mechanics of a federal margin call. He will only understand that the checkbook is closed. And he will blame me," I said, a small, weary smile touching my lips. "He will assume I somehow manipulated the federal government, the banks, and the global commercial real estate market just to spite him." "Let him," Greg said, his tone turning sharp and protective. "His delusions do not change the legal reality. You are fully insulated. The authorities are doing the heavy lifting now. We just have to stand back and let the dominoes fall." Speaking of which, the sheriff's department has been notified regarding the eviction order for the primary residence. The 48-hour window is ticking. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The morning sun was reflecting off the glass towers, painting the city in brilliant shades of gold and silver. I had built cipher holdings brick by brick, writing algorithms late into the night, sacrificing sleep and social events to create something entirely self-sustaining and legitimate. I had hidden my success because I wanted a partner who valued my mind and my heart, not my bank account. David had failed that test spectacularly. He had looked at me and seen a servant. He had looked at his mother and seen a queen. Now the harsh light of reality was exposing the truth. I was the architect of my own empire, and they were the squatters residing in a condemned building. The trap was not something I had set with malicious intent. It was simply the inevitable consequence of their own deceit. I had merely handed them the shovel, and they had dug their own financial grave with remarkable efficiency. Greg gathered the empty folders and offered a firm nod before stepping out of my office, leaving me in the quiet sanctuary I had built. I stood by the glass for a long time, watching the city breathe, feeling the heavy weight of the past 3 years finally lifting from my shoulders. The trap had closed. The federal authorities were moving. All that remained was the final desperate thrashing of a cornered animal. I knew David better than he knew himself. He would not accept defeat gracefully. He would scramble, clawing for any possible lifeline to maintain his illusion of grandeur. I walked back to my desk and picked up my secure phone, anticipating the inevitable outburst. It was only a matter of time before the reality of Patricia's frozen accounts reached him. Miles away in the sprawling suburban house that no longer belonged to him, David paced the length of the living room like a caged predator. His phone was pressed tight against his ear. His mother had just delivered the catastrophic news. Patricia had been sobbing, her normally imperious voice reduced to a frantic, breathless whisper as she explained the margin calls and the federal compliance locks. David hung up the phone and threw it hard against the plush leather sofa. The dull thud echoed through the tense silence of the room. He ran his hands through his hair, gripping the roots until his scalp burned. The eviction order was scheduled to be executed in less than 48 hours. The bank had rejected the wire transfer. His mother was functionally bankrupt. The walls were closing in, threatening to crush his entire existence. Vanessa sat frozen on the edge of a velvet armchair, her carefully contoured face pale with raw terror. She had spent the entire morning browsing online catalogs for Italian marble to redesign the master bathroom, fully believing Patricia was going to wire the funds to clear the mortgage. Now she stared at David, her hands trembling in her lap. She asked him what they were going to do. She reminded him that her boutique was bleeding money, that her suppliers were threatening to halt shipments, and that she absolutely refused to move into a cheap apartment. David glared at her, his jaw tight with helpless rage. He snapped that he was out of options. He had exhausted his credit. He had drained his retirement accounts. His mother was facing federal investigations. He told Vanessa that they were ruined. Vanessa slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her silk blouse. The panic in her eyes began to harden into a sharp, calculating gleam. She told David to stop pacing and listen to her. She walked over to the mahogany coffee table and picked up her tablet. She explained that she had not been relying entirely on Patricia. Vanessa had always been a social climber, expertly networking at charity galas and exclusive country club mixers. She told David that over the past 3 weeks, she had been quietly courting a high-level connection she made at a silent auction. The contact represented a highly exclusive, notoriously private venture capital group based in New York. They specialized in resurrecting distressed luxury brands and providing massive cash injections to struggling entrepreneurs. David stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He asked her what she was talking about. Vanessa tapped the screen of her tablet and held it up for him to see. An official calendar invitation glowed brightly. She announced that she had secured a formal pitch meeting for 9:30 the following morning. She had submitted a comprehensive business plan for her boutique proposing a massive nationwide expansion. The venture capital group had reviewed her preliminary financials and expressed serious interest. They were offering a lifeline investment of $5 million. Vanessa smiled, her confidence returning in an instant rush. She told David this was their salvation. $5 million would instantly save her boutique, pay off the house, clear his outstanding debts, and even provide enough capital to bail his mother out of her current liquidity crisis. David stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the sudden pivot from absolute destruction to unimaginable wealth. He read the details of the meeting, seeing the prestigious address and the formal language of the invitation. The shadowy nature of the firm did not bother him. In fact, it appealed to his vanity. Elite venture capital groups operated in the shadows. They did not deal with ordinary people. They dealt with visionaries. His chest puffed out, drawing in a deep breath of renewed arrogance. The sheer terror that had gripped him only moments before evaporated, replaced by a toxic, intoxicating wave of superiority. He looked at Vanessa and laughed, a loud, booming sound that filled the living room. He pulled her into a tight embrace, kissing her cheek and praising her brilliance. He declared that they were untouchable. Brittany walked into the living room holding her smartphone, looking confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. She had been crying earlier, worried about losing her bedroom and her friends. David waved her over, his face flushed with manic excitement. He told his daughter to stop looking so miserable. He announced that her future stepmother had just saved the day. He promised Brittany that they were not losing the house, that they were going to be richer than ever, and that he was going to buy her the new car she had been begging for. Brittany's eyes lit up, and she immediately rushed over to hug Vanessa completely, forgetting the viral humiliation she had suffered just days prior. David pulled his phone out from the cushions of the sofa. His thumbs hovered over the screen. The impending $5 million investment made him feel invincible. He wanted to make sure Nina knew that her pathetic attempts to ruin him had failed. He wanted to crush any hope she had of seeing him suffer. He ordered Vanessa and Brittany to stand together in front of the large picture window overlooking the manicured front lawn. He stood beside them, holding the phone out to frame the shot. He told them to smile, to look as happy and wealthy as possible. The camera clicked, capturing a portrait of pure, unadulterated delusion. David, Vanessa, and Brittany grinning like lottery winners, completely blind to the reality of their situation. David stared at the photo, highly satisfied with the composition. He opened his messaging app and selected Nina's contact. He attached the picture and began typing with furious, spiteful energy. He wanted his words to sting. He wanted to leave her feeling completely powerless. He typed that she was dead in the water. He informed her that they had just secured a multi-million-dollar pitch from an elite venture capital firm. He boasted that her little accounting tricks and fake debt collections were nothing compared to the massive influx of cash they were about to receive. He finished the message by promising to hire the most ruthless legal team in the state. He threatened to drag her through years of litigation, to strip her of everything she owned, and to personally bury her in court. He hit send, smiling as the message confirmed delivery. In my quiet office, the soft chime of an incoming message broke the stillness. I picked up my phone and opened the text from David. I looked at the photograph first. David, Vanessa, and Brittany, beaming with arrogant triumph in the living room of a house they no longer owned. I read the vicious words beneath the image, absorbing his threats and his boasting. He was so proud of Vanessa's $5 million pitch. He was so certain that this shadowy elite venture capital group was going to swoop in and rescue his family from their own incompetence. I slowly set the phone face up on my desk, letting the glow of the screen fade to black. A genuine, profound smile spread across my face. I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, shaking my head at the sheer predictability of his massive ego. Vanessa had indeed secured a meeting. She had spent weeks desperately pitching her boutique to a prestigious anonymous investment firm. What neither of them realized was that the elite venture capital group Vanessa was scheduled to meet with tomorrow afternoon was a wholly owned subsidiary of Cipher Holdings. I was going to be the one sitting across the table from her. Greg did not close Vanessa's file after we finished reviewing the fraudulent inventory reports. Instead, he opened a clean legal memorandum and placed it beside the financial statements. We need to separate what makes her business worthless from what may expose her to criminal liability, he said. Our investment committee can reject the application based on the hidden liabilities and fabricated valuation. Any evidence of deliberate fraud must be preserved and referred through the proper legal channels. I nodded. I did not want anyone later claiming that I had manufactured a trap because of my personal history with David and Vanessa. Vanessa had approached our subsidiary voluntarily. She had submitted the documents herself, certified their accuracy, and requested $5 million based on the figures they contained. My responsibility was to ensure that every step from this point forward was beyond challenge. Confirm the chain of custody on every file I instructed. Preserve the original uploads, their timestamps, the transmission records, and the signed declaration she submitted with the application. No one is to alter a document or coach her into making a statement. Greg made a note on his tablet. The boardroom recording system will be activated under the standard due diligence notice. They acknowledged the disclosure when they accepted the meeting invitation. Good. Let Vanessa present her business exactly as she planned, I said. Do not interrupt her. Do not provoke her. I want her to explain the valuation, the inventory, and the projected revenue in her own words. If she corrected the false information before the meeting, the company could treat the matter as a failed application and walk away. But if she knowingly repeated the fabricated figures while requesting millions of dollars, she would confirm the intent behind the documents. Greg opened another folder. This one contained the foreclosure filing against David's house, the preservation notice covering Patricia's accounts, and the draft petition my divorce attorney had prepared. The property action is moving on a separate track, he said. David's default existed long before the barbecue. His attempt to interfere with your employment is also documented independently. Vanessa's investment application will not be used to influence either proceeding. That distinction needs to remain clear, I replied. I am not going to give them a technical argument that everything was one personal revenge operation. For years, David had dismissed me as someone who did not understand money contracts or power. Now the only thing protecting him from even greater consequences was my insistence that every action remain disciplined, lawful, and supported by evidence. I looked again at the photograph he had sent. David, Vanessa, and Brittany were smiling in the living room, convinced the promised investment had already saved them. They had mentally spent money that had never been approved. David believed $5 million would erase a defaulted mortgage. Vanessa believed a polished presentation could conceal years of false accounting. Brittany believed her father's confidence was the same thing as security. None of them understood that an investment meeting was not a rescue ceremony. It was an examination. Who will be in the room, I asked. You, me, and 2 members of the investment review team, Greg answered. Outside counsel will remain available, but will not enter unless necessary. Building security has also been notified not to intervene simply because David becomes loud. They will act only if he threatens someone or refuses to leave. I closed Vanessa's folder. When the pitch is over, I will deny the investment, I said. Then I will disclose the conflicts of interest and give them an opportunity to respond to the discrepancies. After they leave, council can decide what must be referred to the authorities. Greg studied me for a moment. Are you certain you want to sit across from them personally? Yes, I replied. Not because I need to humiliate them, because David used my supposed ignorance to justify every insult he ever aimed at me. Tomorrow, he is going to see that the person he treated as a servant was the only person in his life who understood exactly how fragile his world had become. Greg gathered the documents into separate binders, labeling each one according to its legal purpose. The foreclosure file remained apart from the investment review. Patricia's forensic audit remained apart from Vanessa's application. David's recorded threats remained with the civil litigation materials. By the time the city settled into darkness, every piece was in its proper place. No manufactured evidence, no impulsive retaliation, no shortcuts that could later weaken the case. The next morning, Vanessa would not be entering a theatrical ambush. She would be walking into an ordinary corporate due diligence meeting, carrying the evidence of her own deception. The next morning brought a clear sky to Chicago, the bright sunlight reflecting off the steel of the financial district. I sat at my desk well before 9 o'clock nursing black coffee while the large monitors on my wall transitioned to live security feeds of the building lobby. I had instructed the front desk and executive assistants exactly how to handle our 9:30 appointment. They were to be polite and observant. I wanted to see how David, Vanessa, and Patricia behaved when they believed they were walking into a room full of strangers holding $5 million. At exactly 9:15, the revolving doors spun open. The camera feed showed the three of them stepping into the marble atrium. They moved as a unit radiating a deeply toxic manufactured confidence. Vanessa was dressed in a tailored crimson dress carrying a designer black leather portfolio that held her fabricated business plan. David wore his most expensive navy suit, his chest puffed out looking around the lobby, as if he were evaluating the building for purchase. Patricia trailed behind them, wearing a structured cream blazer and pearls, her chin tilted upward in a practiced pose of wealthy superiority. I turned up the audio feed on my console as they approached the reception desk. The young woman working the desk offered a warm smile. She asked for their names and the nature of their business. Vanessa did not return the smile. She placed her hands flat on the polished stone counter and leaned forward, her tone dripping with intense condescension. She announced that they were the executive team for Vanessa Lane Boutique and were expected upstairs immediately for a premier pitch meeting. She instructed the receptionist to print their visitor badges. The receptionist simply nodded and processed their passes without a single complaint. David snatched the badges from the counter before the receptionist could even offer them, muttering under his breath about the incompetence of entry-level support staff. He guided Vanessa and his mother toward the private executive elevators, oblivious to the crucial fact that their entire interaction was being broadcast directly into the office of the chief executive. I watched them step into the elevator car. The enclosed camera captured their private conversation as the illuminated numbers climbed higher. Patricia adjusted her pearls and sighed. She complained that the lobby decor was a bit too sterile for her taste, but acknowledged that these venture capital firms rarely prioritized aesthetics over profit margins. David checked his reflection in the mirrored doors, adjusting his tie. He told his mother that aesthetics did not matter when the firm was about to hand them $5 million. He boasted that by next week they would have the funds to crush the foreclosure proceedings, pay off her margin calls, and leave me absolutely nothing in the divorce. Vanessa smiled, pulling a compact mirror from her purse to check her lipstick. She told David that she could not wait to see the look on my face when they moved into a proper estate and left me rotting in a cheap apartment. She patted her leather portfolio, assuring Patricia that the financial projections she had prepared were foolproof. She claimed these investors were just men with deep pockets who loved a good story, and she was fully prepared to give them the performance of a lifetime. The sheer magnitude of their shared delusion was almost difficult to comprehend. The elevator chimed and the doors slid open to the top floor. The executive suite was designed to intimidate and impress. The floors were dark mahogany, and the walls were lined with original contemporary art. A wall of frosted glass separated the reception area from the main boardroom. My brilliant assistant Julian stood waiting for them. He offered a polite greeting and asked if he could take their coats or offer them a warm beverage before the meeting began. Patricia handed him her coat without making eye contact, demanding a cold glass of sparkling water with exactly 2 slices of lemon. David ordered a black coffee, telling Julian directly to make sure it was not cheap corporate garbage. Vanessa ignored him, walking past the reception desk and pushing open the heavy glass doors to the main boardroom. She gasped audibly as she stepped inside, and David and Patricia quickly followed. The boardroom was the crown jewel of the Cipher Holdings building. The exterior wall was composed entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the vast expanse of the lake beyond. A long table carved from reclaimed walnut dominated the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The morning light flooded the space, highlighting the impeccable luxury of the environment. I watched on the monitor as David walked straight to the window, pressing his hands against the glass. He let out a low whistle of appreciation. He told Vanessa that this was the real deal. He pointed out various landmarks, declaring that once her business expansion was funded, they would need to look into leasing a corporate space just like this. Patricia took a seat near the head of the table, running her hand approvingly over the polished wood grain. She stated that it was about time they started dealing with people of their own caliber. She lamented how exhausting it had been watching her son drag himself down to the level of a common wife. Vanessa arranged her documents on the table, lining up the fraudulent ledgers and the fabricated inventory reports with meticulous care. She took a seat next to David, smoothing her crimson dress. She told Patricia that they never had to worry about my dead weight again. She poured herself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the table, taking a slow, confident sip. She leaned back in the plush leather chair and announced that this mysterious chief executive was about to become their best friend. She was absolutely certain that her charm and her inflated numbers would secure the investment before the hour was over. They sat there in the sunlit boardroom, 3 people utterly convinced of their own untouchable superiority. They laughed about their impending victory. They mocked my modest lifestyle. They spent the money in their minds buying new houses, new cars, and country club memberships. They were so blinded by arrogance and greed that they did not question why the meeting had been so easy to secure, or why the firm had moved so quickly on their application. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the front of my charcoal gray suit jacket. The time for silent observation had passed. I picked up the thick black binder containing the true forensic analysis of Vanessa Lane Boutique. I walked out of my office and down the quiet hallway toward the boardroom. The muffled sound of their laughter drifted through the frosted glass doors. They were waiting for a savior to walk into the room and hand them the keys to an empire. I gripped the cool metal handle, feeling my pulse steady. I pushed the door open, stepping into the bright sunlight, ready to watch their world shatter into dust. As I crossed the threshold, my stiletto heels sank slightly into the plush carpet before meeting the polished hardwood border of the room. The soft metallic sigh of the closing doors immediately silenced the nervous chatter inside the boardroom. Greg followed a half step behind me, the thick black binders clutched securely under his left arm. David was standing near the expansive windows, his back to the city skyline. At the sound of the opening door, he spun around. I watched him quickly button his tailored navy suit jacket, his chest expanding as he plastered on the winning, charismatic smile he reserved exclusively for men with deep pockets. He extended his hand, stepping forward with eager anticipation to greet the elusive savior of his crumbling reality. Then his eyes focused directly on my face. David's extended hand stopped in midair. The polished smile remained on his lips for a fraction of a second before collapsing. He had heard me say that I controlled Cipher Holdings. He had seen my signature on the foreclosure documents. But until that moment, he had treated every piece of evidence as part of an elaborate bluff. Seeing me walk into the executive boardroom in a tailored charcoal suit, with Greg carrying the official investment files behind me, made that comfortable denial much harder to maintain. "You," David said. The single word emerged as a mixture of accusation and disbelief. His hand slowly dropped to his side. He looked beyond me toward the hallway, apparently expecting another executive to appear and explain why his estranged wife had entered a confidential meeting. Vanessa rose halfway from her chair. She clutched the edge of the table, her confidence briefly shaken before suspicion took its place. "What is she doing here?" Vanessa demanded. "This is a private investment meeting. She cannot simply follow us into the building because she is angry about her marriage." Patricia turned sharply toward the door. "Call security," she told Greg. "This woman has already forged foreclosure documents and interfered with our family's finances. She has no right to be in this room." I did not respond. I continued to the head of the table and placed one hand on the back of the chair reserved for the presiding executive. David watched every movement. "You claimed you owned Cypher," he said, attempting to recover the contemptuous tone he had used on the phone. "But a logo on a piece of paper and an expensive suit do not make you a chief executive. Did you rent this room for another performance?" I pulled the chair out and sat down. Greg placed the black binders in front of me and remained standing at my right shoulder. "No one followed you into this building," I said. "You were invited here." Vanessa gave a brittle laugh. "By Meridian Growth Partners," she replied. "Not by you." "Correct," I said. "Meridian Growth Partners invited you." A flicker of relief appeared in her expression. She looked at David as if she had finally found the explanation she needed. "This is another one of her tricks," Vanessa said. "She probably discovered where the meeting was being held and convinced someone downstairs that she belonged here. The actual investors will arrive any minute." Greg opened the first binder and removed the signed meeting confirmation Vanessa had submitted. He placed it on the table beside her leather portfolio. "Meridian Growth Partners is a wholly owned investment subsidiary of Cypher Holdings," he said. "Your application was screened by its retail acquisition division and escalated for executive review because of the size of the requested investment and the inconsistencies in your supporting documents." Vanessa stared at the paper. The name Cypher Holdings appeared beneath the subsidiary disclosure she had accepted electronically without reading. David leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "You expect us to believe she controls this entire firm?" he asked. "Nina spent 3 years entering numbers into spreadsheets from a spare bedroom. That was the cover story she used in her private life," Greg replied. "It was never her professional position." Patricia shook her head in furious denial. "This is absurd. I know people in Chicago finance. I would have heard of her." "You heard of Cypher Holdings," Greg said. "You simply never asked who founded it." David looked at me again. For the first time, his expression contained something beyond anger. He was mentally replaying every lecture he had given me about money, every time he had mocked my work, and every occasion on which he had used the house to remind me that I depended on him. I rested my hands on the closed binder. "You assumed the foreclosure notice was forged because accepting it as real would have required you to accept that you never knew your own wife," I said. "You assumed the investment meeting would rescue you because you never considered who was reviewing the application." Vanessa's gaze moved from me to the panoramic windows and then to the embossed folders on the table. The color began to drain from her face. Greg addressed all 3 of them with the calm precision of someone reading an official record. "For the avoidance of any further misunderstanding, Nina is the founder, chief executive officer, and controlling shareholder of Cypher Holdings. She is also the executive chair of Meridian Growth Partners, the firm evaluating Vanessa Lane Boutique's request for $5 million. He placed one final document in front of Vanessa. "This is not a rented room, and Nina is not an assistant who wandered into your meeting. Every financial decision concerning your application is hers to approve or deny." For a long, suffocating moment, nobody moved. The silence was so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the climate control system and the distant wail of a siren miles below on the city streets. I watched the blood drain entirely from David's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack. His eyes darted frantically between Greg and me, searching for the punchline to a cruel joke he desperately hoped was being played on him. He blinked rapidly as if trying to clear a hallucination. Patricia sat perfectly still, her hand frozen mid-air, her glass of sparkling water resting against her bottom lip. Vanessa looked as though the air had been physically punched from her lungs. She gripped the arms of her leather chair so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply opened the thick black binder Greg had placed in front of me. The crisp sound of turning pages echoed sharply across the long walnut table. I looked directly at my husband. David. I began keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of the warmth he had exploited for 3 years. You came here today under the impression that you were securing the final piece of your grand escape plan. You thought you were outsmarting a naive, boring wife and upgrading to a brilliant entrepreneur. I pulled a sheet of heavy stock paper from the binder and slid it smoothly across the glass surface of the table. It came to a stop directly in front of him. That is the commercial loan application you submitted to our subsidiary bank last week, I explained, watching his eyes drop to the document. The one you attempted to secure using the equity of the house I paid for. As you can see by the red stamp at the top, it has been definitively denied. David stared down at the paperwork. His lips moved trying to form words, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He looked up at me, a pathetic mixture of terror and disbelief contorting his features. Nina, he choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing reality. Nina, what is this? What are you doing? I reached into my jacket pocket, retrieved my phone, and placed it flat on the table. I think you explained your intentions best yourself, I replied. I tapped the screen once, pressing play. The audio recording filled the quiet boardroom, crystal clear and utterly damning. David's smug, arrogant voice rang out from the device. The recording captured him boasting about how he had called my previous employer to get me fired, bragging about how he was leaving me with absolutely nothing, and laughing about how I would soon be begging him for alimony. I watched Patricia flinch as her son's cruel laughter echoed off the glass walls. She slowly lowered her water glass, her aristocratic facade cracking. Vanessa stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I let the recording play to the very end, allowing the heavy silence to stretch out again once it finished. I locked eyes with David, watching the last remnants of his towering ego crumble into dust. You wanted me fired, David. Consider my resignation from our marriage accepted. You will be hearing from my legal team by the end of the day. David collapsed backward into his chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, defeated groan escaped his throat. I did not give him another second of my attention. I turned my cold gaze to Vanessa. She instinctively shrank back, pulling her black leather portfolio closer to her chest, as if the thin material could shield her from the incoming devastation. Now let us discuss this premier pitch meeting. I continued, flipping to the next tab in my binder. You walked into my building today, expecting to walk out with $5 million. You presented a glossy portfolio full of aggressive revenue projections and exclusive luxury branding. I pulled out a stack of financial logs and spread them out in a neat row in front of me. Unfortunately for you, Vanessa venture capital firms do not invest based on pink tissue paper and confident smiles. We perform forensic accounting. I tapped my pen against the top spreadsheet. You are currently holding over $200,000 in commercial rent arrears. Your landlord has drafted an eviction notice for your storefront, which you managed to delay solely by promising them this exact venture capital investment. You have been frantically shifting debt between 3 separate limited liability companies to keep your primary ledger looking clean to amateur investors. I watched Vanessa's crimson dress seem to lose its vibrant color as her face went completely pale. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some fabricated excuse, but I did not allow her the opportunity to defend herself. It gets significantly worse, I told her, flipping to the accounts payable reports. You owe tens of thousands of dollars to independent local designers. You took their custom jewelry and handmade garments on consignment, sold them at a massive markup to the wealthy women at Patricia's Country Club, and never remitted a single dollar of the profits back to the creators. You are actively stealing from local artisans to fund your personal luxury car leases and daily high-end dining, I stated, my voice echoing in the large room. You even tried to write off your personal cosmetic procedures as client networking expenses. You are treating a failing retail storefront like a personal checking account. Patricia slowly turned her head to look at Vanessa. Her expression of arrogant boredom had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She realized her own social circle had been scammed. Vanessa, Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. What is she talking about? Is this true? Vanessa shook her head frantically, a bead of sweat rolling down her temple. She is lying, Patricia. She is just jealous. She is trying to ruin us because David chose me over her. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my tone silenced her instantly. I pulled out the final stack of documents, the warehouse inventory logs. I would not need to lie to ruin you, Vanessa. Your own inventory reports do that perfectly well. You confidently claimed your current retail stock is worth nearly $800,000. I cross-referenced your unpaid supplier invoices with your listed inventory. You are actively buying mass-produced $20 garments from overseas wholesalers, ripping out the tags and relabeling them as highly exclusive luxury boutique imports. You value them at $400 a piece on your balance sheets. Your entire company valuation is a complete documented fabrication. Greg leaned forward slightly, resting his large hands on the table. He looked directly at Vanessa, his expression grim. Presenting highly manipulated financials across state lines to a venture capital firm in an attempt to secure $5 million is not just a bad business pitch, he noted, his voice calm and precise. It is federal wire fraud. Vanessa began to physically shake. The arrogant woman who had strutted into my lobby demanding immediate attention was entirely gone. In her place sat a terrified fraudster, finally realizing she had just walked straight into a trap of her own making, handing all the evidence directly to her greatest enemy. I closed the black binder and folded my hands over the cover. I leaned forward, holding Vanessa's terrified gaze, refusing to look away. You came here demanding a fortune based on lies, theft, and artificially inflated assets, I said, my voice ringing with total finality. I wouldn't invest $5 in this vanity project, let alone $5 million. The echo of my final word hung in the air, vibrating against the thick glass walls of the boardroom. Vanessa let out a sharp, ragged gasp, sounding exactly like a drowning woman finally breaking the surface of the water, only to find no oxygen. Her hands trembled violently as she reached out to pull her fabricated inventory reports back into her leather portfolio. She fumbled with the pages, tearing the edges of the glossy paper in her blind panic. David stared at the ruined documents, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw a full breath. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire future burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to hurl another useless threat, but I did not give him the satisfaction of a single response. I simply turned my head and shifted my cold gaze entirely away from him and the crumbling mistress sitting at his side. I shifted my attention to Patricia. She had remained silent while Vanessa's financial deception was exposed, but the rigid set of her shoulders suggested she was already preparing to distance herself from everyone in the room. Her gaze moved between the fraudulent inventory reports and the documents Greg had placed before me. Nina, she began, forcing her voice into the controlled register she normally used at country club meetings. Whatever Vanessa has done is between her and the authorities. I had no role in preparing those financial statements. I came here only to support my son. You came here expecting the investment to restore access to your wealth, I replied. You told David that the $5 million could cover the mortgage, repair your investment accounts, and preserve your family's position. That is not a crime. No, I agreed. But the condition of your accounts is not connected to Vanessa's application. It is connected to the estate you inherited from Arthur. Greg placed a gray binder in front of her. Unlike Vanessa's glossy presentation, it contained certified property valuations. historical loan records, trust statements, and copies of the federal preservation notices served on the bank. Patricia did not touch it. My husband left me a legitimate estate, she said. I had professional advisors. I signed whatever they placed in front of me. That may affect whether the authorities believe you knowingly participated, I said. It does not change the condition of the assets. Greg opened the binder to a marked page. The commercial properties supporting the family trust were repeatedly valued far above their actual market value, he explained. Those inflated values were used to secure additional borrowing. The proceeds were moved through several companies before being invested in increasingly risky instruments. When the properties were independently reassessed, the collateral no longer covered the outstanding loans. Patricia's fingers tightened around her pearls. I will sell the estate, she said. I will liquidate the remaining properties and settle whatever technical discrepancy exists. You cannot transfer them, Greg replied. A preservation notice and provisional lien have been filed while the authorities trace the source and movement of the funds. Selling or concealing an asset now would expose you to additional liability. The last of Patricia's practiced composure disappeared. You did this, she whispered at me. You waited until David and I offended you, and then you destroyed everything. No, I said. David defaulted on his loan before the barbecue. Arthur created those liabilities years before I joined this family. The independent reassessment reduced the value of the properties. The bank imposed the compliance hold after the records were referred for review. I did not create any of those facts. You bought the fund, she said. Cypher acquired an interest in a distressed portfolio through an ordinary commercial transaction. That acquisition gave our auditors access to records your advisors should have examined long ago. Once the irregularities were discovered, the company was legally required to preserve and report them. Before Patricia could answer, the glass doors opened abruptly. Brittany hurried into the room with a building employee following several steps behind her. Her designer sunglasses were pushed into her hair, and her phone was clutched in one hand. Unlike the theatrical tears she had produced for her followers, the panic on her face was real. Dad, she said, looking directly at David. What is happening? My card was declined at the restaurant, and the leasing company says there is a hold on the car account. She noticed Patricia at the table. Grandma, the bank told me the family trust is under review. You said everything would be fixed this morning. David stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward. Brittany, you should not be here. You stopped answering your phone, she replied. Everyone online is asking why I deleted the video, and now none of my cards work. Her eyes finally landed on me at the head of the table. The hostility returned for a moment, but it was weakened by fear. You are doing this, she said. You froze my trust because of what I posted. No, I answered. Your social media video did not freeze the trust. Patricia looked sharply at her granddaughter as if she too needed to hear the distinction. The trust is under a federal tracing order because investigators are determining how much of it was funded through the loans and transfers connected to Arthur's estate, I continued. Until that review is complete, the trustees cannot issue new distributions or pay discretionary expenses. Brittany's face tightened. So when will they release my money? Greg cannot answer that, and neither can I. If the assets are proven legitimate, the trustees will follow the authorities' instructions. If the assets represent proceeds of fraudulent loans or unpaid tax liabilities, they may be used to satisfy those obligations. My car is being taken because of something my grandfather did. The lease was being paid through the family holding company, Greg explained. The company missed its latest payment after the accounts were frozen. The lessor is exercising its contractual right to recover the vehicle. Brittany looked toward David as if expecting him to contradict everything. He remained silent. What about my video? She asked. That is a separate issue, I said. You publicly accused me of stealing from your father and emotionally abusing you. Those statements were false. Your original recording, the upload records, and the messages encouraging people to threaten me have all been preserved. Brittany's mouth opened, but I continued before she could invent another explanation. My attorneys will send you a formal demand to remove the remaining copies, preserve all communications relating to the video, and issue a correction. Whether the matter develops into a defamation action will depend largely on what you do next. I was upset, she whispered. Dad told me you were stealing the house. David looked away. Being upset does not give you the right to fabricate abuse or send hundreds of strangers after someone, I replied. You are 17, which means the adults around you should have stopped you. Instead, they praised you because the lie benefited them. Patricia turned toward David. You allowed her to post those accusations while knowing the mortgage was in default. David began to answer, but no coherent explanation came. Brittany slowly lowered herself into a chair. For the first time since the barbecue, she was not performing for a camera. Her phone rested dark in her hand as she processed the difference between temporary online attention and consequences that could not be erased by deleting a post. Patricia stared at the federal notices in front of her. Brittany stared at her father. Vanessa sat beside a stack of documents proving her business was fraudulent. With his mother collapsed at the table and his daughter stunned beside him, David finally seemed to snap out of his paralyzed state. The arrogant, untouchable alpha male he pretended to be vanished entirely. He looked at the wreckage of his family, and then he looked at the woman who had orchestrated it all without breaking a sweat. David rounded the corner of the large table, his movements jerky and desperate. He stumbled blindly toward me, practically falling to his knees onto the hard floor as he gripped the edge of the glass table directly in front of my chair. Greg immediately shifted his weight, stepping forward to intercept the sudden movement, but I raised a single hand to stop him. I wanted to hear exactly what my pathetic husband had to say for himself now that his lies were fully exposed. Nina, please. David begged, his voice cracking with raw, pathetic desperation. Please, you cannot do this. You have to stop this. This is my family. This is my mother. You cannot just wipe us out like this. You wiped me out, David, I reminded him softly. You planned to leave me with absolutely nothing. You laughed about it on my voicemail. You sat in my house and plotted my financial ruin so you could fund a scam artist. No, you do not understand, David stammered, shaking his head frantically. He reached out as if to take my hand, but thought better of it when Greg glared at him. I was stressed, Nina. The bank was pressuring me. The business was struggling. I was not thinking clearly. We used to be happy. Remember our first year together? We had a good marriage before all this pressure started. I just lost my way. He continued to grovel, claiming Vanessa had pressured him into filing the commercial loan application using our house. He claimed she had threatened to leave him if he did not secure the $5 million. He painted himself as a naive, overworked husband who had fallen prey to a calculated predator. He begged me to remember the vows we took, promising he would cut Vanessa out of his life forever if I reversed the foreclosure. He turned his head, his tear-filled eyes locking onto Vanessa, who was still trembling in her seat. His expression hardened, shifting from desperate pleading to vicious blame in an instant. It was her! David shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Vanessa. Vanessa manipulated me. She got into my head, Nina. She fed me all these lies about her brilliant business plan and how much money we could make. She convinced me that you were holding me back. She is a fraud. You proved it yourself. She scammed me just like she scammed my mother's friends. I never would have done any of this if she had not dragged me into her desperate little schemes. I was a victim here too. Vanessa gasped, her head snapping up to stare at the man who promised her the world just 30 minutes ago. David, how could you say that? She cried, her voice echoing with genuine betrayal. You said you loved me. You said you were trapped in a miserable marriage with a boring loser. You planned this with me. I sat perfectly still, listening to them tear each other apart in the center of my beautiful boardroom. The absolute fragility of their so-called love was on full display. The moment the money disappeared, their loyalty vanished with it. They were turning on each other like starving animals fighting over scraps. I looked at Patricia, who was crying over her lost social standing. I looked at Brittany, who was weeping over her repossessed car. I looked at Vanessa, realizing she was going to face federal prison entirely alone. And finally, I looked at David, now practically on his knees, begging for my mercy. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been permanently shattered. I looked down at David. He was clutching the edge of the glass table, his knuckles white, his chest heaving with desperate, jagged breaths. The sharp lines of his expensive suit seemed to hang loosely on a frame that had lost all its structure. He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and leaking tears of pure self-pity. He was waiting for a lifeline. He was waiting for the woman he had spent 3 years breaking down to suddenly revert to her old compliant self and offer him salvation. Patricia let out another wretched sob from the end of the table. Vanessa sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide and vacant as she stared at the wall, paralyzed by the looming reality of a federal indictment. I felt absolutely nothing for any of them. The empathy I had once freely given to David and his family had been completely burned away, leaving behind only a cold, hard clarity. I watched my former husband weep, realizing I did not even recognize the man kneeling before me. He was just a coward who had built his entire identity on the money of women. "Nina, please say something," David pleaded, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Please just give me a chance to fix this. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just call off the bank. Please, I am begging you. Do not leave me like this." I slowly reached across the table and retrieved my phone. I slipped it back into the pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I stood up the legs of my leather chair, gliding silently over the hardwood floor. Greg stepped back, creating a clear path for me to the heavy double doors. I looked down at David one last time, making sure my cold, unwavering gaze captured his complete attention. "You told me to apologize or leave, David," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "I left. Now it is your turn." I turned my back on him. I did not wait for his response. I walked away from the table, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished wood border of the room. Greg followed a step behind me, a silent, imposing guardian securing my exit. As I reached the heavy glass doors, David let out a strangled, desperate cry of my name, but the sound was abruptly cut off as Greg pulled the door open and I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind us, clicking into place with a solid metallic lock. The sobbing, the begging, and the panic were instantly sealed away. I walked toward the elevators, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air. I had never felt so incredibly light. 6 months passed. The transition from winter to the bright days of early summer brought a profound sense of renewal to the city. But for the people I had left behind in that boardroom, the changing seasons only brought an unrelenting cascade of natural consequences. David found himself entirely unemployable in the corporate finance sector. The public exposure of his fraudulent loan application made him a massive liability. Mounting legal debts forced him to take the only job that would hire him. He was now working as an entry-level retail associate at an electronics store in a dying suburban mall, spending his days wearing a cheap blue polo shirt and standing behind a cash register. He endured the daily humiliation of angry customers yelling at him over expired coupons, forced to smile and apologize to people he once considered beneath him. His tailored suits were sold to consignment shops to pay the interest on his massive legal fees. His arrogant charm was completely erased, replaced by the dull, exhausted stare of a man who realized he would spend the rest of his life paying for his own greed. Vanessa did not fare any better. The local designers she had stolen from filed a massive class action lawsuit. Her boutique was shuttered within a month, the windows covered in brown butcher paper, with an eviction notice taped to the front glass door. She was forced into a humiliating public bankruptcy. Her luxury cars were repossessed. Her designer bags were seized as assets, and she was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom in her parents' small house. She spent her days navigating court dates and dodging calls from furious creditors. Her grand illusion of being a wealthy entrepreneur was permanently destroyed by the cold facts of federal financial regulations. She had to watch helplessly as her former friends publicly distanced themselves, deleting every photograph they had ever taken together from their social media profiles. Patricia and Brittany faced a different kind of collapse. The federal review of Arthur's estate lasted for months. Investigators eventually confirmed that much of the family trust had been supported by inflated property values, undisclosed liabilities, and income on which the appropriate taxes had never been paid. The authorities did not seize every legitimate dollar, but after the outstanding loans, tax assessments, penalties, and legal expenses were satisfied, only a fraction of the fortune remained. It was nowhere near enough to sustain Patricia's estate staff, country club memberships, or carefully managed social life. The suburban property was sold under the supervision of the trustees. Most of the proceeds went toward liens and creditor claims. Patricia moved into a modest two-bedroom condominium outside her former neighborhood. She resigned from the charity boards she could no longer afford to support and quietly allowed her country club membership to lapse. The people who had once surrounded her at luncheons and fundraising galas did not disappear because I ordered them to. They disappeared because their friendship had always depended on what Patricia represented. Once the estate invitations and financial influence were gone, so were they. Brittany's discretionary trust payments remained suspended throughout the investigation. When the legitimate portion of the trust was finally calculated, it was placed under strict professional management, rather than returned to the family's unrestricted control. Brittany received limited educational and living support, but there were no more unlimited credit cards, luxury vacations, or vehicle leases disguised as family business expenses. The sports car was repossessed after the holding company stopped making payments. Brittany initially blamed me, then the bank, and finally her grandmother. It took months before she acknowledged that none of them had created the financial structure that collapsed beneath her. Her social media story also followed her. Under advice from counsel, she deleted the false accusations and posted a correction acknowledging that she had no evidence Nina stole from the family or abused her. Several sponsors ended their informal arrangements with her, and the private school placed her conduct under review after copies of the threats sent by her followers were produced. For the first time in her life, Brittany had to separate attention from achievement. She took an administrative job at a dental office while completing her final school requirements. The work was not degrading despite the way she had once spoken about ordinary employees. It was simply unfamiliar. She had to arrive on time, follow instructions, and treat people politely, even when no camera was watching. I took no pleasure in the fact that Patricia and Brittany had lost the lifestyle they once considered permanent. I had not designed their trust's falsified property values or encouraged Brittany to publish lies. Their new lives were not punishments I had personally selected. They were what remained after borrowed money, hidden liabilities, and social performance could no longer protect them from reality. I did not think about them often. They were ghosts of a past life, shadows I had outgrown and left far behind me. I stood on the balcony of my high-rise penthouse, letting the warm summer breeze sweep across my face. The view from 40 stories up was absolutely breathtaking. The city stretched out below me in a glittering, endless grid of lights alive with energy and possibility. I rested my hands on the railing, watching the sun slowly dip below the distant horizon. The sky was painted in strokes of gold, crimson, and deep violet. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. The heavy, suffocating weight of David's expectations, Patricia's cruel judgments, and my own crippling self-doubt had been completely lifted. I had walked into a life of subjugation and allowed myself to be diminished, but I had clawed my way out and built an empire of my own. I owned my success and my future. As the sunlight disappeared and the city lights grew brighter, I smiled. I was finally free, entirely on my own terms, completely untouchable. The greatest deception toxic people pull is convincing you that your worth is inherently tied to their approval. For years, I allowed myself to be the compliant, silent background character in a narrative written by people who actively despised me. I swallowed their casual insults, dismissive gestures, and blatant disrespect because I falsely believed family and marriage required infinite sacrifice. But sacrifice should never mean permanently surrendering your dignity to individuals who only view you as a convenient resource to be exploited. Walking away from that glass boardroom taught me that true power does not need to roar. It does not throw childish tantrums or post spiteful, desperate videos online. True power is silent, strategic, and deeply self-assured. When you stop pouring your valuable energy into the people who only drain you, you immediately create the space necessary to build an empire of your own. The absolute best revenge is never about matching their cruelty. It is about completely removing their access to your life and letting their own reckless, greedy choices deliver the exact consequences they earned. You do not have to accept the role of the victim or the forgotten understudy. You hold the absolute right to rewrite your story, to fiercely secure your own future, and to walk away from tables where respect is no longer served. The exact moment you finally realize your own value, the people who relied on your self-doubt will instantly lose all their leverage. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment or rewrite a narrative someone else forced upon you? Share your stories of reclaiming your power in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding your strength. Remember, your future belongs entirely to you.